The word never made a sound. It formed in the space between a child's terror and a stranger's attention, shaped by lips that barely moved, delivered in the half-second before a sliding door erased her from the world. One syllable, 3 letters. And if Dale Harmon hadn't been watching, if his eyes hadn't drifted across that Oklahoma truck stop parking lot at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the right direction, 11-year-old Cassie Pruitt would have disappeared into the American highway system like smoke into wind, and nobody would have known where to begin looking. That single silent word, mouthed by a frightened child to a stranger she had no reason to trust, would set in motion 86 miles of highway pursuit, a coordinated law enforcement response that crossed 2 county lines, and a reunion so raw and so desperate that the troopers who witnessed it would talk about it for years. But none of that existed yet in the moment Dale's coffee went still in his hand, and his retired deputy's mind began doing the only thing it had ever truly known how to do. Dale Harmon was 53 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life learning to read the small things. Not the dramatic signals, not the obvious ones that anyone could see, but the quiet details that existed in the margins of ordinary situations, the posture that was slightly too rigid, the smile that didn't reach the eyes, the way a person's hands moved when the rest of their body was trying to appear relaxed. He had learned this skill in the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office, where he'd spent 21 years working patrol, then investigations, accumulating the kind of institutional knowledge that couldn't be taught in a classroom and couldn't be transferred to paper. It lived in the body. It expressed itself as a feeling that arrived before the reasoning did, a quiet alarm that said something here does not fit, and that had been right often enough that Dale had learned to trust it even when he couldn't immediately explain it. His knees had ended the career before he was ready to let it go. 3 surgeries, a medical board, a retirement ceremony with a plaque and a handshake, and then the particular disorientation of a man trained for urgency who suddenly had nowhere to direct it. He had spent a difficult year finding his footing. His ex-wife had remarried. His daughter was in college in Norman and called on Sundays. He had a house in Broken Arrow that he kept well, and a garage where he spent evenings working on the Road King that had become simultaneously a project, a purpose, and a form of moving meditation. And he had the Red River Brotherhood MC, 12 men whose ages ranged from 44 to 61, whose backgrounds included military service, firefighting, construction, and in Dale's case, law enforcement, and who shared an unspoken agreement that the years behind the handlebars were as good a way as any to stay connected to something that mattered. The club ran a veterans fundraiser every spring that had grown from a small local ride into a 3-county event that raised substantial money for a transitional housing program in Tulsa. They did the toy drive in December with the kind of organizational seriousness that would have impressed a logistics coordinator. When the floods came to the small towns along the creek south of Tulsa, the Red River Brotherhood showed up with trucks and tools and the particular competence of middle-aged men who had long since stopped needing to be told what to do in a crisis. They were not a club that sought attention. They were a club that showed up, did the work, and rode home. Dale had found in their company something that approximated the brotherhood of the department without requiring him to carry a badge he no longer had. He had left Broken Arrow that Thursday morning under a sky so clear and blue it looked painted, heading west on Interstate 40 toward Oklahoma City for a weekend gathering at a brother's house outside Yukon. The fall weather in Oklahoma was its own reward after the grinding heat of summer, and Dale had taken his time, stopping once for fuel east of Henrietta and again at the Love's Travel stop just off the interstate west of town, where he'd filled the tank, bought a large coffee, and spent a few minutes walking the stiffness out of his left knee in the parking lot before heading back to the bike. He was moving slowly. That was the thing he would return to afterward, the simple, unremarkable fact that his knee was bothering him and he was in no particular hurry, and he was walking slowly across a parking lot in the middle of a Thursday afternoon with coffee in his hand and nothing in his mind except the pleasant anticipation of another 2 hours of good riding weather. He was not looking for anything. He was not in a heightened state of alert. He was a retired deputy with sore knees, enjoying a fall afternoon, and it was precisely that ordinariness, that absence of focused intention, that allowed him to see what a person looking for something specific might have missed entirely. The white cargo van was in the far row of the lot, parked away from the fuel islands in the section where semi-trucks clustered and travelers stretched their legs between long highway stints. It was the kind of van that existed by the hundreds of thousands on American roads. No markings, no logos, older model with a few rust spots along the lower panel. The kind of vehicle that had been designed by its very commonness to pass through the world without leaving an impression. A man stood at the sliding side door, heavyset, somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a task on a schedule. He was pulling the door open, his body half turned away from the parking lot, creating a gap between himself and the van's interior that lasted for less than 2 seconds. In that gap, Dale saw the girl. She was young, 11 or 12 years old, with dark hair that had been pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly come undone, strands loose around her face. She wore a yellow shirt and jeans, and she was sitting or crouching in the van's interior in a way that suggested her movement was constrained, not by a seatbelt or a car seat, but by something else, something in the posture, the tightness of her shoulders, the way her body occupied that small visible space with a particular, careful stillness. Her face was turned outward, toward the door, toward the opening, toward the ordinary afternoon, and the strangers and the parking lot, and the pale blue sky that existed just beyond the man's body. Her eyes were moving quickly across the available space, the practiced scanning of someone who had been doing this for a while, looking past obstacles, assessing distances, calculating what was possible and what was not. And her eyes found Dale's. He would spend a long time afterward trying to describe what happened in that moment, the quality of the connection, the way her gaze locked onto his with a directness that was nothing like the casual eye contact of strangers in a public place. It was intentional. It was deliberate. It was the gaze of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, a person looking back, a face that wasn't moving past her, a set of eyes that had stopped and stayed. And in the fraction of a second that the door remained open, her lips moved. Run. Not please, not help, not a name, not a number, not a description of what was happening. Just that one word, shaped carefully and completely, the most compact possible instruction from someone who understood that she had one chance and almost no time, and that her only option was to transfer the urgency to someone who still had the freedom to act on it. Run. As though she had thought about this, had rehearsed it, had decided in whatever terrible hours had preceded this moment, that if she ever got a second of visibility in a face that was looking back at her, this was the word she would use. The door slid closed. The man moved around to the driver's side without looking back at the parking lot. And Dale Harmon stood in the middle of a Love's Travel Stop parking lot in eastern Oklahoma with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand and 21 years of law enforcement experience organizing itself into a sequence of immediate actions. He set the coffee on the hood of the nearest car. He was already moving toward his bike and already dialing before the van's engine turned over, his eyes fixed on the rear of the vehicle, memorizing the Oklahoma license plate with the same automatic focus that had once served him at accident reconstructions and crime scenes. He reached his Road King as the van began to back out of its space. He was talking to the 911 dispatcher before he started his engine, identifying himself clearly, giving his location, describing the vehicle, reciting the plate number, and delivering in compressed and specific language what he had seen through that sliding door. The dispatcher's voice shifted register in the way trained voices do when information crosses a threshold from routine to urgent. She told him units were being dispatched. She told him to maintain visual contact without engaging the vehicle. Dale said he understood, and he meant the parts he intended to mean, and he started his bike and pulled out behind the van with the steady, unhurried focus of a man who had already done his deciding. The van turned south from the truck stop and picked up the service road before merging west onto Interstate 40. Dale followed at 4 car lengths, close enough to maintain an unbroken visual on the vehicle, far enough that a single motorcycle in the driver's mirrors would blend into the general texture of highway traffic rather than register as consistent pursuit. The sky remained that pale fall blue. The Oklahoma plains opened up in every direction, flat and enormous, the kind of landscape that made distances feel abstract and speed feel almost irrelevant. Dale settled into the focused mechanical rhythm of following, cataloging the van's behavior, noting its lane position, its consistent speed of 72 miles per hour, its complete absence of erratic movement. Whoever was driving knew how to move on a highway without attracting attention. That knowledge itself was a data point. The dispatcher came back on his earpiece at the 4-mile mark. The plate had returned to a rental agreement out of a Tulsa location, a cargo van rented 72 hours earlier under a name she couldn't share, but that had triggered a flag in the system she also couldn't detail over an open line. What she could tell him was that the Oklahoma Highway Patrol had a unit 11 miles west on I-40 and another coming north from McAllister, and that both had been briefed on the vehicle description and the plate. He was to maintain position. He was not to attempt to stop. He was to report any change in the van's behavior immediately. Dale acknowledged each instruction in the brief affirmative of someone who had given and received exactly this kind of radio guidance for 2 decades, and he kept riding. He was thinking about the girl's face, not the fear in it, though that had been present and unmistakable, but the clarity, the intentionality, the decision-making visible in the way she had used the 2 seconds available to her. She had not panicked. She had not screamed. She had not wasted the moment on anything that wouldn't transmit across a parking lot in the time it took a door to close. She had assessed her situation with a precision that no child should have needed to develop, and she had delivered the most efficient possible communication to the only available recipient. And then the door had taken her back into the dark, and she had waited to see if it had worked. Dale intended to make sure it had worked. At mile marker 44, the dispatcher relayed additional information in careful, partial language that told him the flag on the rental had connected to an ongoing investigation he wasn't cleared to know the details of, but that the urgency level on the responding units had increased. He understood what that meant without needing it spelled out. This was not an isolated incident. The man in the gray t-shirt had done this before, or was part of something that had been done before, and the girl in the yellow shirt might not be the first passenger that cargo van had carried across Oklahoma on a Thursday afternoon. The cold anger that had been sitting in Dale's chest since the parking lot settled deeper and became something else, something quieter and more absolute, the kind of resolve that didn't require maintenance or tending because it had moved past the stage of emotion into simple fact. He was going to follow this van until it stopped or until law enforcement took over, and he was going to do it without making a mistake. Because making a mistake right now, being spotted, triggering a sudden acceleration, causing the driver to exit onto a rural county road where the terrain would shift entirely in his favor, any of that could make things worse for the girl, and making things worse for the girl was the one outcome that was not acceptable. The van's brake lights came on briefly at mile marker 48. A half-second flicker that wasn't connected to any visible change in traffic. Dale noted it and eased back another car length, adjusting the following distance with small, smooth throttle changes that produced no visible effect on his speed from behind. The brake light had been a moment of awareness, a driver checking his mirrors, registering the texture of the vehicles behind him, looking for patterns. Dale rode without pattern. He changed lanes twice in the next mile, casually, mimicking the behavior of a traveler adjusting position in traffic. And when he settled back into the right lane, the van was still ahead and still moving at 72, and the driver's attention had apparently found nothing to concern him. At mile marker 51, the trooper who had been waiting on the shoulder pulled out onto the highway. He did it cleanly and without drama, merging into traffic 2 vehicles behind the van, his lights dark, his speed matching the flow. Dale recognized the move. It was the beginning of a soft box, a loose containment that could tighten gradually without announcing itself until the moment of decision. He held his own position and reported to the dispatcher that the first unit was in place. She acknowledged and told him the second unit was coming up the on-ramp at mile marker 58, 7 miles ahead. They were going to bracket the van between 2 marked units and 1 civilian rider, and when the moment was right, they were going to bring it to a stop in a controlled environment on open highway where the variables could be managed. Dale kept his eyes on the rear of the white cargo van and kept his throttle steady and kept the girl's face in his mind, the way her eyes had found his across a parking lot, the way her lips had moved with such careful deliberateness, the words she had chosen and the faith she had placed in a stranger she had never seen before and would not see again until this was over. He intended to be worthy of that faith. He had 86 miles to prove it. The second trooper unit merged onto Interstate 40 at mile marker 58 with the same practiced casualness as the first, sliding into the flow of traffic without lights, without drama, settling into position ahead of the van in the left lane with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that belonged exactly where it was. Dale watched the geometry of it come together from his position 4 car lengths back, the loose triangle of containment forming around the white cargo van like something inevitable, like the landscape itself was slowly, quietly closing in. The van moved between them with no apparent awareness of what was happening, maintaining its precise 72 miles per hour, holding its lane, performing the perfect imitation of a vehicle with nothing to hide. Dale had been on the radio with the dispatcher continuously, his voice low and steady in the earpiece, reporting lane changes, speed variations, anything that deviated from the pattern. There had been very little to report. The driver was disciplined. He understood highway behavior the way someone understood it who had studied it deliberately, who had thought about what ordinary looked like from outside and had practiced inhabiting that ordinariness until it became automatic. That discipline was itself a form of evidence. Ordinary people did not think this carefully about appearing ordinary. Ordinary people drove with their minds half on the road and half on whatever was waiting for them at the destination. This man drove the way someone drove when the cargo behind him was the only thing that mattered, and getting caught with it was the worst possible outcome. The dispatcher told Dale at mile marker 63 that the decision had been made to execute the stop at the rest area 4 miles ahead, where the highway widened and a dedicated pull-off provided controlled space with minimal civilian exposure. The troopers had coordinated their timing. The lead unit would activate lights and move to block forward progress. The trailing unit would close the gap behind. Dale was instructed to hold his position and not advance past the rear of the van once the stop began. He acknowledged and shifted his right hand slightly on the throttle, easing back just a fraction, giving himself the additional distance he would need to stop cleanly if the van braked hard. He was thinking about the girl again, about how long she had been in that van before the parking lot, about what she had been doing in those hours before a retired deputy with sore knees happened to be walking slowly across the right parking lot at the right moment, about whether she could hear the engine sounds outside and whether any of them registered to her as different from the miles that had already passed. He hoped she could hear his bike. He hoped that somewhere in the closed and lightless space of that cargo van she could feel that something had changed, that the ordinary highway noise around her had acquired a new element that was staying with her, not passing, not fading, keeping pace. He hoped she knew that the word had reached someone who was still running. The rest area appeared ahead as a widening of the right shoulder, a low building with restrooms, a cluster of picnic tables under flat-roofed shelters, a dozen civilian vehicles parked in the designated spaces. The lead trooper's lights came on at mile marker 67 with a sudden blue and red brilliance that transformed the ordinary afternoon into something else entirely. The sound of the siren reached Dale a half-second later, a single whoop that was more instruction than alarm, the universal signal that said, "Pull over, this is not a request, your options have just narrowed to one." The van's brake lights came on hard. For 3 seconds, that lasted considerably longer than 3 seconds, Dale watched those lights and watched the van's trajectory and waited to see which direction the driver's panic would choose. A hard right into the rest area was cooperation. A hard left across the median was a decision that would change the nature of everything that followed. The van went right. It decelerated into the rest area at a speed that was still higher than it should have been, the tires making a sound on the pavement that communicated something about the urgency of what was happening behind the wheel, and it pulled to a stop in the far end of the parking area with the nose angled slightly toward the exit in the unconscious geometry of someone who hadn't entirely given up on the possibility of running. The trailing trooper came in behind and to the left, cutting off that angle with the efficient positioning of a unit that had done this many times. Dale stopped his bike at the entrance to the rest area, engine still running, and stayed where he was. The troopers were out of their vehicles before the van had fully stopped, moving with the focused economy of officers managing a high-stakes stop in a public area. Weapons at the low ready, voices carrying the particular command authority that came from training and repetition and the absolute certainty that compliance was the only reasonable option. The driver's door opened after approximately 15 seconds, which was 15 seconds of calculation and conclusion, and the man in the gray t-shirt stepped down from the van with his hands visible and his face wearing the expression of someone who had run the numbers and accepted the result. Dale watched from the entrance as the troopers secured the driver, as additional units began arriving from both directions, as a plainclothes vehicle pulled in with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested its occupants had been moving toward this location for some time already. He sat on his idling Road King, and he watched and he waited, because his job now was to stay out of the way and let the people with current badges do what current badges were for. It was the waiting that was the hardest part. It was the not knowing what was behind the cargo doors, the suspended space between what he had seen in a parking lot 40 minutes and 86 miles ago and whatever confirmation or contradiction was about to come through those doors. He had been certain. He had been certain in the way that 21 years of reading human behavior produced certainty, a deep structural confidence in his own read of the situation. But certainty and confirmation were different things, and until those doors opened, he was a retired deputy who had tailed a cargo van across 2 counties on the strength of a word mouthed by a child through a gap that had lasted less than 2 seconds. A female trooper approached the rear of the van with bolt cutters. The padlock on the cargo doors came apart on the second attempt. She pulled the doors open and stepped back, and in the pale fall afternoon light of a highway rest area in eastern Oklahoma, the interior of that van became visible to the assembled officers and to Dale Harmon, sitting on his motorcycle 40 feet away. He heard the girl before he saw her clearly, a sound that was part cry and part gasp, the involuntary noise of lungs taking in open air after a long time without it, the sound of a person encountering the outside world after being separated from it. And then, the female trooper was climbing into the van and speaking in the low, careful voice that officers used with frightened children, and there was movement inside. And then the trooper was helping someone down from the cargo bay, a small figure in a yellow shirt with a mostly undone ponytail, who stepped down onto the pavement of an Oklahoma rest area and stood in the afternoon light and looked around with the dazed, blinking expression of someone who had just passed through something and hadn't yet fully processed the passage. Dale saw the moment she understood she was safe. It happened in stages, the way comprehension always happened in stages when the mind had been managing terror for an extended period and suddenly didn't need to anymore. First, the physical reality, open air, space, no walls, the sky above her. Then, the faces around her, uniforms, badges, voices that were kind rather than threatening. And then, in a gradual sweep of her eyes across the rest area, her gaze found the motorcycle at the entrance and the man sitting on it, and something in her face shifted in a way that Dale would carry with him for the rest of his life. She had seen him before, in a parking lot, through a gap in a van door, in the 2 seconds she'd had to use, and she had used those 2 seconds to send him a word, and the word had apparently arrived. One of the troopers came over to Dale after approximately 10 minutes, a tall man with a sergeant's stripes and the unhurried walk of someone who had a lot to cover and had learned to do it efficiently. He introduced himself and asked Dale to give a formal account of what he had witnessed at the Love's travel stop, which Dale did, completely and in order, the way he had been trained to provide witness accounts, specific details, timeline, his own actions, and the reasoning behind them. The sergeant listened without interrupting and made notes, and when Dale finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way people were quiet when they were deciding how to say something. He told Dale that there had been 2 children in the van. Cassie Pruitt, 11 years old, reported missing from her home in Muskogee 31 hours earlier, and a second girl, 9 years old, whose name he couldn't share yet, but whose family had been searching for her for 4 days. He told Dale that the driver was known to a federal task force that had been working a trafficking route through the Mid-South for 14 months, and that this stop had just produced the first physical evidence and live witness testimony that the task force had been working toward. He told Dale that without the pursuit and the continuous position reporting, the van would have exited onto State Highway 270 at the next interchange and reached a secondary location in a rural area of Hughes County, where law enforcement response time would have been measured in the kind of minutes that changed outcomes permanently. He told Dale that both girls were going to be all right. Dale sat with that information for a moment in the quiet way that men who have spent their careers managing their own reactions sat with things. Then he nodded and thanked the sergeant and asked if there was anything else he needed. The sergeant said there would be a formal statement required, that someone from the task force would be in contact, and that Dale should plan to make himself available. Dale said he would. The sergeant extended his hand, and when Dale shook it, the sergeant held it for a beat longer than a standard handshake required, which communicated something that neither of them put into words. The female trooper who had opened the van doors came over a few minutes later and asked Dale if he would be willing to speak briefly with Cassie before her transport arrived. She explained that the girl had been asking about the motorcycle, specifically about whether the man on the motorcycle was still there. Dale said he was willing, and the trooper walked him over to where Cassie Pruitt was sitting on a bench near the rest area building, wrapped in an emergency blanket despite the mild temperature, a bottle of water in her hands. A victim's advocate crouched beside her, speaking quietly. Dale sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving space, not crowding, and waited for the girl to set the pace. She looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were still processing everything her body had been through in the past 31 hours, still recalibrating the difference between what the world had been and what it was now. Then she asked him, in a voice that was smaller than it probably usually was, whether he had seen her in the parking lot. He told her yes. He told her he had seen her, and he had understood, and he had followed the van the whole way and hadn't let it out of his sight for a single mile. She absorbed this in silence for a moment. Then she asked if the word she had used had been the right word, because she had been trying to think of what to say, and she had decided that run was better than help, because help might make someone go inside and find someone else, and that would take too long. But run meant go now, right now, don't stop. Dale told her it had been exactly the right word. He told her she had thought clearly in a situation where most adults would not have thought clearly, and that she had made the best possible decision with the information and the time she had, and that the word had reached him completely and without any confusion. He told her she had done everything right. She looked at him for another moment with those recalibrating eyes. Then she told him that she had kept watching through a small gap between the doors during the drive, a place where the seal wasn't quite flush, just a sliver of highway visible, and that she had been trying to see whether a motorcycle was still back there. She said she couldn't really see anything, just movement and light, but that she had kept watching anyway, because it had felt important to keep watching. She said it had helped, not knowing for certain but keeping the possibility alive that someone was back there. It had helped her stay calm. Dale told her that someone had been back there for every one of those 86 miles, and that she had never once been out of his sight. Her parents arrived 40 minutes later, her mother first, who had driven from Muskogee at a speed that her husband, who had followed in a separate car, said he would not describe to law enforcement. The reunion happened in the open air of that rest area parking lot with the particular violence of relief that had been compressed too long, her mother's arms going around Cassie with a force that communicated 31 hours of the worst kind of waiting, and Cassie making a sound into her mother's shoulder that was not quite crying and not quite anything else but was the sound of a child returning to safety after being very far from it. Her father stood with his hands on both of them, and his face doing something that faces did when they had been braced for the worst possible thing and had instead been handed back the best possible thing, and the adjustment was almost too large to process. Dale stood at a respectful distance and watched and felt the particular quality of completion that he had always associated with cases that came out right, the ones where the sequence of small decisions and small actions had added up to the outcome that mattered. Cassie's mother found him before he left. She was still holding her daughter's hand with both of hers, the grip of someone who was not going to be releasing that hand for a considerable period of time, and she came over to where Dale was standing by his motorcycle, and she looked at him with the direct and uncomplicated gaze of a mother who had almost lost her child and had been given her back and needed the person responsible for that return to understand what it meant. She told him that she didn't have words for what he had done. She told him that she had been told the details of the parking lot, the 2 seconds, the single word, the 86 miles, and that she had been trying since she'd heard it to understand what kind of person made those decisions in that sequence, what it was in a person that produced that particular response to what most people would have dismissed as an ambiguous moment in a parking lot. Dale told her it wasn't complicated. He told her daughter had asked for help in the clearest possible way, and he had been in a position to provide it, and that was the whole of it. The mother shook her head slightly, the way people shook their heads when someone was being modest in a way that was technically accurate, but missed the point entirely. Then she hugged him, this woman he had never met before the last hour of his life, with the sincerity of someone for whom the gesture was the only available container for what she was trying to communicate. Cassie looked at Dale over her mother's shoulder. She raised her free hand in a small wave, the kind a child made when words had run out, but something still needed to be said. Dale raised his hand back. He rode into Oklahoma City that evening 2 hours later than planned, the fall sky having shifted from pale blue through orange and pink into the deep purple of a clear October dusk. He called his chapter president from the highway and gave him the short version of what had happened, because the Brotherhood deserved to know when one of their own had been in the middle of something that mattered. His president was quiet for a moment, and then said what chapter presidents said in these situations, which was not very much but meant a great deal. Dale rode the last 40 miles in the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, the road opening ahead of him in the fading light, his mind settled in a way it hadn't been settled since before the retirement, since before the knees and the plaque and the handshake and the long, disorienting year of finding his footing. He had been useful. Specifically, precisely, consequentially useful in the way he had been trained to be useful and had spent years missing the opportunity to be. A child had mouthed a word in a parking lot, and he had been the right person in the right place at the right moment, and he had done what that combination of factors required, and 2 girls were home tonight who would not have been home otherwise. The federal task force made 12 arrests over the following 6 weeks, working outward from the intelligence produced by the van stop and the driver's subsequent cooperation. The trafficking route that had operated through eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas for 14 months was dismantled in its entirety. 3 additional victims were located and returned to their families. The case became a training reference for highway interdiction procedures, specifically for the role of civilian observers in establishing early pursuit contact before law enforcement units could position. The Red River Brotherhood MC established a new program the following spring, partnering with the Oklahoma Highway Patrol and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to run community awareness sessions at truck stops and rest areas along the I-40 corridor. They called it Eyes on the Highway. Dale ran the sessions himself, standing in front of groups of travelers and truckers and rest stop employees with the same patient directness he had once brought to departmental briefings, explaining what small signals looked like, what they meant, why they mattered, why acting on them was worth the risk of being wrong. He told Cassie's story every time in the same quiet voice, without dramatizing it, because the story didn't need dramatizing. It needed telling exactly as it had happened, because exactly as it had happened was the clearest possible illustration of everything the program was trying to teach. In the program's first 2 years, 3 participants reported suspicious situations at rest stops and highway locations based on what they had learned. 2 of those reports produced law enforcement responses that confirmed the participants' observations. One of those responses produced an outcome similar to the one on Interstate 40 in October. A child recovered, a perpetrator in custody, a family given back what it had almost permanently lost. Cassie Pruitt turned 13 the following July. Her mother sent Dale a photograph of the birthday party, a backyard gathering with streamers and a lopsided cake, and Cassie in the center of it with the unself-conscious grin of a kid who had been through something terrible and had come out the other side and was now just a kid at her own birthday party. On the back of the photograph, in the careful handwriting of someone who had thought about what to say and had decided on simplicity, Cassie had written 4 words. The word worked. Thank you. Dale put the photograph in his garage on the shelf above the workbench where he spent his evenings, in a spot where he could see it from wherever he was standing. Not as a trophy or a reminder of something he had done, but as a reminder of something she had done, this 11-year-old girl who had managed 2 seconds and 1 word and an absolute refusal to stop believing that somewhere out there was a person who would see her and respond. He looked at it sometimes while he was working, in the particular quiet of late evenings when the garage smelled of oil and metal and the Road King sat, half-assembled under the work light, And he thought about the specific courage it took to mouth a single word through a closing door at a stranger you had no reason to trust, knowing it might not work, doing it anyway. He thought about how much of the world's most important help had been asked for exactly that way, quietly, quickly, in the margins of ordinary moments, by people who had almost given up on being seen, but had not quite given up yet. And he thought about what it required on the other side of that ask. Not heroism exactly, not anything dramatic, just the willingness to be looking, to be present, to let the ordinary afternoon pause for long enough to register what was actually happening in it, to see someone who was trying to be seen and to move.